Hello and welcome to another episode of the AI Relay, the internet's #1 AI podcast with John Spanos. I'm Andrew Signori.
What's up, guys? And I am John Spanos. And today we're going to talk a little bit about, I think, the changing state of memory. It used to be that I had to restart everything from the beginning, right? It was this annoying, you just met the agent for the first time every time. But now, is it just me, or I'm feeling like session to session, my ChatGPT and my Claude, they kind of remember things that I was talking about in previous sessions?
Yeah. That's something. I think the conversation about memory, it's an interesting one because it's really evolved a lot since, maybe even since a lot of people have tried the last time that they tried AI. And that, very much the case, like in the early days were, 2 years ago or a year ago, uh, when you went and started a new chat, it was a new session, it was a blank slate. You needed to kind of, you might need to reintroduce an idea that you've hashed through already in a previous chat.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I would even go and copy and paste contents from a chat into a different chat, just to kind of get it to where I needed it to be to continue um, to take it and share that thought, right? Um, that isn't necessarily the case anymore. And I think there's been a lot of improvements that it's certainly within the same AI labs tools, right? If you're using ChatGPT and OpenAI, if you're chatting in a new session, it will remember who you are. It will remember that thing you asked it last week, right? Like if you were asking it for restaurant recommendations, it would be like, oh, you last week you went to this one. So let me give you a new one. Even though there wasn't any of that context in the chat, it now has a sort of shared memory across all your other chats. And
Broader context somehow. Somehow it seems like it has a continuity of a broader context. And so if that's not happening in the chat's, context window,
right.
then is it kind of like a RAG, where we used to
It
say,
is
well, the
kind of like
retrieval augmented, mm,
it is kind of
the
like a
M, I
rag,
forget the M.
and it is. I would say that it is indexing the gist of lots of conversations, and it has and it essentially has that augmenting its knowledge base. Now that I don't believe that memory is taking up context window, but maybe it is. To be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure.
I mean,
Because
whatever, it's got to read something to know something,
it does, but at the
basically.
same time, I do know that it has recollection of things that we've talked about in the past. That being said, it could certainly make a mistake that it's made before. And I
Mm.
could be like, hey, this has happened before, and we got around this before somehow. And the AI's response will be like, all right, let me check and see how we did that in that previous conversation in a previous session someplace else. And it's able to go in and recall and look at that and be like, okay, that's how I did it there. And, kind of continue on and, uh, you know, with its
And
mission.
actually, you basically remember the way it solved the problem and repeat the solution rather than having to try to figure it out again from the get-go, which
Now,
is a pretty, that's an advancement for lots of things. Token usage, also just the feeling of you're not dealing with a mind numb idiot kind of,
well, and its ability to do that too is, and it's improving, and and it's and a lot of people find it not good enough.
the memory of it, or
Yeah.
that
It's
it's not
still,
it's not remembering me enough.
so I think you know, there's that old adage is it's a feature, not a bug,
Hmm.
and because context window is something that is best being, clear.
Hmm.
And because the memory in the beginning of a window is so much better than that at the end, that you don't always, you don't always want all this preloaded context within every session, because then it's you're not really starting from that fresh context window. You're bloating that window, you're front loading it with all this stuff.
This
Um,
noise in a way. I mean, it might be
well,
relevant noise,
it may or may not be relevant, and
right?
that's
I mean, to some degree, right? Like all of this has been working off of the system prompt all of this time, right? Like for the last few years, no matter what's happening, like you start a session, there is some system prompt that gets read, and then those are the first tokens essentially in the context window. So there's a
well,
kind of session tax
this,
that you will pay
the system prompt is essentially going to be injected in front of like every message,
if
right? Because
and
if you think about it, like the
that's
system
high
prompt,
token cost.
well, I mean, if you have a very large system prompt, then yeah, like um, but that's like there is, if you that system prompt, it's like every time a message comes across, right? That's why, like, that's a lot of like the guardrails that exist on, let's say, ChatGPT are like, contained within like essentially this, because it's like it needs to be there in front of the model for every message to make sure it's like you're not, you aren't somebody is that's going to give any of these pieces of information away, or
Yeah,
like,
it's always the
or
last thing that it read. It's always the last thing that read is
if
this new
your
instructions.
system prompt for an agent is like you're a customer service agent and you are providing service for people who have put in orders for your company, right? You need that system prompt to exist, and every time it's going to be interpreting the 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 the, the chat or the prompt from the user. It always needs to know, like, I'm a customer service agent, like, like other, you know what I mean? Every time. Um, because you don't want someone to be like, well, who's your favorite Yankee? Or like something that has no context to that thing. Like you need to make sure that like that's always there. That is like that system prompt
That's the constraints. The most constraining way to constrain a
is
model
to
is to constantly tell it the same thing over and
there's
over
also
again.
such a thing as a user prompt, right? Like there's the same concept of system prompt that is user prompt. And a user prompt is a prompt that you're putting in front of any message that's coming from a user to be like, hey, to say like, hey, I'm a user. I'm a user of your company. I'm a customer. And like my questions are about what such and such. And if I'm asking questions about this, it's like that maybe I'm not a customer, or like maybe you should ignore it. You know what I mean? Like
Like
there's
a
also
filter,
ways to insert that sort of prompt in front of a
like
user, have
a
a user.
templated filter. Like if it doesn't fit this, if this key doesn't fit this hole, then that's not
Now,
a true user.
and so
Interesting.
this isn't like an important concept when you're doing like agent to agent communication, right?
Agent to agent.
Because it when you have an agent, one agent that's talking to another agent A talking to agent B, agent A is the user and agent B is like in this case the agent, right? Like I'm sending him like first, I'm sending a message. So it's like, how do you protect against prompt injection on an agent like that's speaking to another agent? Well, it's like one of the ways you could do that is by like putting a user prompt in front of anything coming from agent A to be like, this is sort of like this is the expected,
Format or
context of like requests coming from me.
sure, there could be a specific header on it that's like if it doesn't have this header,
Yes. So anyway,
it's not gonna be right. That's
all of these
interesting.
things exist in the memory of these of
And
your
that's right, to connect it back. So like, you know, the system prompt and the user prompt, that's been around for a long time. In a way, were these the early layers of what are becoming memory now, what we're calling
well,
memory? Because we weren't calling it memory back then, but it was persistent context, which what is memory if it's not persistent context?
if you think about it, right, all these like features that have been like added on. So like so when you think about like like adding a skill to an agent or like an MCP, which is like a tool for an agent to use. Like
Mhm.
all of these things like will add a little bit, like the instruction on how to use that thing, or like specific domain skills in an area that you want to define for your agent, right? Like it's going to load this stuff. All these things are going like when the models first came out, the token windows were relatively small compared to today's standards, right? Like the amount I thought it was an incredible amount that you could put like 5 pages of text in a prompt. Now you can fit like the entire library of Harry Potter books in a single prompt. So like it's dramatically changed. So like as even like what is considered full or half, like we always say like, oh, the beginning of a context memory is best, right? But in relation to with the old context memory windows, what we consider like the good memory in a 1 million context is like probably 4 times the size of the entire context window of old models. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying memory in that context as well, because I guess I don't know that I was thinking of memory as being within the context window, but that's almost like the first layer is whatever it recognizes at that live moment within the context window. And then what we're layering now on around the session are these persistent files that can be referred to and gives the impression of a kind of persistent memory and
So
recognition.
memory, when we're talking, so there's context memory, and then there's like memory, like we're talking about, like, all right, outs like because context memory, it fills and then it clears, right?
Hmm.
And then when it clears, especially when it's like working on something and it's like, oh, I have no more memory to work. I need to clear it. It like essentially gives itself a summary of everything that it's done within that period. It writes the summary, clears its memory, rereads that summary. Now it like its only knowledge of everything it's done up to that point is what was contained in that summary.
In that summary. And that
Sometimes things get
summary,
lost.
that create, well, lots of things get summarized, I guess, and so lost. And the perception is that it still remembers things because it's
Yes.
still in the context window. Like the first new tokens in the new, after the summarization are the reading of the summarization. Those are those first tokens that go in the bucket. And so you keep going. And it's still oriented essentially to if you're
Now,
working on a project or having a conversation about a certain
that
topic.
being said, right, as context windows improved and got larger and larger, meaning you can fit more tokens before you needed to like re-summarize and clear it out. Like those summaries can now get better, right? Because like let's say I'm allowing my summary to take up 1% of my context window, right? Well, like 1% of like 1,000, is what, like it's 10. Like like 1% of a million,
Right.
is like
You have a whole
100,000.
essay. Yeah.
Right.
You can write an
Or
essay of a
10,000.
summary.
Yeah. So like, it's and we're still talking about now like only 1% of the context window. And now an early memory is better than late memory, right? Because like the you've got, just less stuff to have to parse through. Um there are less seats in the theater, essentially, it
In the
gets harder
context
and
window.
harder to
Yeah.
manage memory as there's like less available memory, right? So it's like you still have is like when think of it as like empty
Hang on,
context
because
window.
there's an important distinction here because you've
Yeah.
tripped me up on this before in other conversations. The word memory, I think there's a bifurcation in the conversation. There's the memory of like the hardware tech minded person talking about like the chip and it fills up with stuff, and then there's the perception of recognition and persistence of personality that is the files that we're talking about wrapped
Yeah,
around
but
the
it's all right.
session.
But it's sort of like the difference between like RAM and a hard drive.
Yes, I think in a hardware
All right, both are
analogy,
memory.
right,
Both of these things are memory.
right.
RAM is like a context window, right? It is like you can fill it up, but like it loses power, it releases its energy, like it releases its memory, it's gone,
It
right?
clears it. Yeah.
It's cleared. And then there's like the hard drive, and that is like your persistent memory. right?
Where you're storing files in
But
databases, let's
the
say.
LLM, like in this case, like the CPU, right? The CPU
Right,
is never looking directly at the hard drive,
right. It
right?
looks at it
The
through the
CPU
RAM.
like is like the computer is going to like take whatever that file is and load it into RAM
Right.
and then read
That's
it
the
from the RAM.
retrieval.
Right. Like it's just like the hard drive's just storing it so the computer can like find it and load it into RAM and then read it from the RAM. So like
And
think of the
so, like,
context window as like RAM and
right.
think of like the idea of like memory, like persistent memory for chats as like the hard drive. And how well the agent or the model like knows to go and look at the hard drive for stuff to be like, oh yeah, I remember. I actually remember that. Like,
That's what
I know we've
remember
got
that
something on the hard
means.
drive. I know we got something on the hard drive for that. Like,
Right.
and the models are getting better and better, or like the tools are getting better and better and better at being like we've done that
Right, so
before.
the platforms, right? Let's just stick with the big boys, not the super customized open claw stuff or whatever, but, you have Anthropic, you have OpenAI, Gemini. They're building behind the scenes, right? So I'm interacting with it, at work doing my thing, not trying to think about all these, like, "How does it do this?" questions. So behind the scenes of my app on my desktop that I'm working on, there's all these solutions, I guess, that these platforms are trying to come up with to give me the user experience. Like, oh no, like I named him Bob, and he totally remembers me every time I come to the computer, kind of thing. Is that? I mean, that's kind of the feeling I'm getting a little bit better. It's not really that recognized. Like maybe within a project, I guess it might recognize you that well, but really, a project is just attaching a lot of files to its session
Well,
so that it has this context.
and there's sort of in like is the feature not a bug part of it as well, right? Like you like within a project, like you want to build like specific context for that project, not other stuff. Like, and you
Mhm.
actually don't want it to take so you might have another project with similar data, but not for this, and it's not to be used in the analysis. And like you don't want your agent to be like, oh, you know what? I think there's some other data in this other project over here. Like, let's take a look at that. Like, you don't
Mhm.
want the memory to be like that, but you do, you might want it to be like, hey, if you're making a presentation um about all the projects that you've worked on this year, uh it's nice to have the agent to be like, oh, you also did that one. Remember that one? Like that, you did Cloud Scout, you did like this,
So
you did
that's
that.
interesting. You can have, I guess,
And I've
different kind of,
had the agent do
well,
that to me.
you
Yeah.
sounds like you're describing almost like a spider web of shared folders and unshared folders. Like you're working in here, but sometimes your output goes over here where this other agent is working over here, and something that output goes in there. And I think you can layer all sorts of projects up that way with Cowork, for example. Maybe there's like a drafts folder that everything should dump into, but different agents are doing different things with different kinds of drafts, emails or memos or something. I don't know. But
So like it exists. It's gotten a lot better. Now there's a sort of like shared memory where it seems to have like an idea between like what you were doing before and what you're doing, and what you're doing now. But I think that there's a lot of people that, once they've reached kind of like they're at the user level where they're having multiple projects and they've got like lots of things and there's lots of information that they've collected within their different chats. They're finding that whatever built-in memory is lacking, especially if they're building like their own agents, like people who are building their own like agents and using agent harnesses to kind of build their like a
their
like an
team.
agent, like a team of agents, and like it's
Mhm.
important that they have like sort of like a shared memory amongst all these agents, right? And like I think when it comes to that stuff, like people have looked beyond what Claude is, giving you out of the box and have kind of sort of like designed their own sort of second brain system for their agents to use and like leveraging, I know that you yourself have even experimented with like more than experimented with,
Yeah.
building your own sort of, second brain memory, because having that sort of ability to recall either what another agent has done or what this particular agent has done in the past sometimes helps it kind of like find keep it on the path of continuing to do things like the way you expect them to do it. Because at the end of the day, that's the biggest risk with agents, right? Is that like all of a sudden
Mhm.
they start doing it differently and you don't get the
Yeah,
out.
and you don't get the output, and you need to catch that they're doing it differently, and figure out how to get it or keep it on track. And the deeper levels of memory, I think it's possible for someone to get to a point using something like Cowork where they've got the projects and the workflow going really well, and they're just feeling like if they would all just remember all of the same stuff, it's organized enough where they're not going to have like scope drift and project drift, but they just don't all remember it, and it's that one extra layer that uh, blows it all wide open when you can talk to multiple agents and they just remember everything you've ever talked about. Like it's not because you're prompt injecting on the session and you're blowing out your context window. It's wiring up these multiple layers of basically just files, right? There's just big directories going into databases. But the like, I want the future to be where you're talking to a character that just is oriented at all times with you, and you could be like, yo, today, we've been working on this thing for the last 3 days, but we finished it. Let's go back to the thing we put on pause. And it goes like, okay,
Yeah,
cool,
I
and
think
it's right
too.
there.
I also think, right, and like AI has evolved quite a bit, but I think that like your perception of AI typically is like what was your first engagement with it, right? Your first real engagement where you first like dug in.
That's natural. That's
And
natural.
I think that like, there's a lot of people that think of agents as like standalone sort of like these, just pieces of software with AI behind them that do their own thing. They live on their own compute and they're these headless operating agents.
Hmm.
To some people, like that's what an agent is. To other people that have like, have maybe their exposure to AI is through OpenClaw, their vision of agents is like, oh no, like an agent is like an entity that
Yeah.
has a
Right.
brain and
Right.
operates like its own kind of computer and operating system. And when it needs stuff or like when we're talking and it needs like another employee, it spawns a sub agent to take on that role. And you're and that's like a very different like vision of or it's they're the same exact thing. And yet it's a very different way of like kind of visualizing what it is that you're building, right? One is like, oh, I'm making like a virtual person,
Yeah.
where the other one is like, I have a task I want to automate, and I'm
Hmm.
going to use AI like for task automation,
Straight up like a tool.
and
I'm
I've
going to
got
turn
like
on this little robot and I'm
just a
going to let the robot spin.
right. And rather than like deterministic code, it is going to be an AI that's going to figure out how to do the thing and solve the problem or whatever. But treating it as just like software, not as like an entity,
Yeah.
an agent as an entity. It's an interesting concept, but I think it like sort of depends on when you were exposed to it. Because if someone were to jump in today, go head first, and get into Hermes agent or OpenClaw, um, you like the way you're going to feel about what an agent is like a virtual like entity,
Right.
and that
Well, that's
entity
what they're trying to make. Yeah.
is going to
That's what I'm
create
trying to make.
like entities that like maybe I'm not going to communicate with those entities, but
Right.
like it will. So like
100%.
it, right. And I think it's a great way to think about agents and multi-agent workflows, but uh it that is like like only one way of looking at agents and what they are and how they can be applied.
It
Uh,
is. I
a
think
pretty
it's one of the
progressive one.
major ways. I think it totally ties into the memory thing because like the way to have this kind of entity, the only way to have this kind of entity is to have this really well orchestrated cascade of memory files, and indices and contents, and it's not that simple really, but it's also not that complicated. It's just, and files in language. Um, but my point is that like an entity in the world it feels like an entity because there's a persistence to it. Like every time I call you, you're still you, right? And that's the layers of memory that are being built now by these big companies are trying to solve the same problems that I think, to your point, like OpenClaw, we got right into it and was like, how am I going to solve this problem? The problem being it doesn't remember anything back in the day. Now the problem is like, I want it to know like what I had for breakfast yesterday, not just what project am I working on.
I also think
Eh,
too that there's like a level of autonomy that you give, like, because of agency, right? Like there's a level of autonomy that you give like an entity to do things versus like I have a very prescriptive task for my agent to do over here. Like I like, I don't want it or need it to be like an entity.
Not
I
every
just
one of them, no, but having this central orchestrator, let's say, I don't like the word orchestrator, but it's a buzzword, but having this one agent that then does the delegation and that has a persistence of memory, it's
yeah, but I'm
it's
right. I'm
awesome.
just saying
It's
that
awesome.
like
It's like having the Star Trek computer is like the
right.
goal. Like,
And I guess like in a way you could build your headless thing by like just you yourself communicating with an orchestrator
that's
and then like
right.
having the orchestrator build out this headless workflow and then you'd be like bye and
That's what
then
happens.
and then
That's what's so awesome.
yeah
I
and that's
design,
that is
design, design, and then like once the design is done and it produces a
I will
document, it's
I will
like,
tell you that like that is that is definitely as someone who's we both messed around with OpenClaw, that's definitely how it works with OpenClaw. That is like in the enterprise, that is sort of like uh that is would be considered like progressive
mhm.
and probably reckless. Um,
I could. There's a reckless edge to it, but it doesn't have to be reckless, of course. But I can understand the progressive because it's. I think there's an old mental model of software that it came
yes.
with a set of instructions, and once you learned the instructions, you knew how to use the software. And managing an AI model is fundamentally more like managing an entity. Even if it's a totally headless script, mini thing that you don't care about, it's if you're allowing it to reason, then you do have to keep an eye on it because if it's not going to be a deterministic code, then it's going to think of it every time from the start. It's going to come up with a new path to the
Um,
same exercise every time.
and this is why too, I always like, I always think like the right amount of AI is the least amount of AI.
Right.
And also
It's a
too,
great
like,
tenet.
and memory is a big part of that too, right? Deterministic
Hmm.
code doesn't need in the sense of like context window. It is going to do the same thing every time. It's going to be provided like, some variables and it's going to just do its thing. And and you don't need to worry about like if I fill up the context window, is it going to make the same types of choices because the context window is 80% full rather than,
Hmm.
20%
Hmm.
full.
Hmm.
And so, I think, a lot of times the right amount of AI is the least amount of, of AI.
I
And
think
like,
that's almost every time that's the right case because that just might mean building in another layer somewhere, but always trying to work toward the least amount of AI, I think is the right mindset.
it just is not sexy. I'll say that much, right? Working in an enterprise where right now, and I love AI, and that's a big part of my job, is like getting people to adopt AI. But there's just everybody wants to solve a problem with AI, even if that problem has already been solved by deterministic software that you own and you just didn't trust to set it on auto, like on
Right.
auto remediate. We haven't had wanted to turn on auto remediation for certain tools because there was a lack of trust. And
But
all of a
now you want
sudden
to trust the model to do it.
it's wild. So,
That's
I think
funny.
that
That's
yeah,
there's a gap there. There's a
yeah.
gap in connecting those two things there. And it's interesting that at the enterprise level, I mean, it's also maybe not surprising. Like that's where archetypes can become so sclerotic because it's such a big ship. You can't make turns very quickly. You can't pivot.
And we use AI to write the deterministic software. And I think that's the unlock that is like that a lot of enterprises miss is that like they're all looking to like build an agent that does it. And it's like, no, you need AI to just write the software that's going to do that thing
Yes.
because
And
you
so
know,
to loop it to the memory thing, like that's where I'm kind of I think that's kind of where I'm watching myself go. Like I'm using my main agent to build the
solutions.
rest of the solutions, like little pieces of software, so that that main agent can then assign agents or run the software itself. I don't really care.
Right.
But
Like
the point
ideally,
is
like
that like
just writes
the it's the layers of memory though that I've created around this main agent that gives it such a persistence of character and recognition that it also will know all of the things that it built, and it becomes a true orchestrator in that way because it has this persistence of memory of each project, and they're not blending. They're all very carved out, and it's
I
almost
think it's
like
a
an
big
operating system with just a mouth.
I think it's a big reason why coding agents is one of the biggest application of AI agents, right? Because at the end of the day, most of the time, like the answer is a deterministic piece of software, not an AI that's going to reason every time through that task. It just if it's reasoned through it once and you want it to reason the same way every time, you're better off being like, all right, now build a piece of software that's going to do that thing
It does that.
every time, just like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know,
Yeah, the real leap forward there is that it's given the ability, or it's taken the project and task of writing code and creating an application, a piece of software, and turned it into like a printer. You know, you have the idea, and then like a 3D printer, like you just hit the button now, and like the application prints, and it's amazing because it's like you have an application printer now. You just have it. You just have to be good at describing it.
right. And that's, and I think right now, anyway, I mean, I think that, you know, maybe in the future, models will just get so good at everything that you
That
know,
you don't even need, yeah, but it's
they'll
still
just
always
start
gonna
their own.
cost tokens, right? I mean, this goes all the way to a fuel efficiency or a token efficiency conversation, essentially. But let's try to keep it scoped here, uh,
Yeah. Well, we could
on the
probably wrap it
memory,
up.
like yeah,
Right.
we can wrap it up. The I think the overall point was that, memory is obviously getting better. The big boys are solving it in their way. If you nerd out on it, you can start solving it your own way. But pay attention to it as you use the platforms, I guess, because you can leverage it. Of course, if there's persistence of memory, there's ways to leverage that and make yourself even more productive because you know you're not having to waste time. Let's say re-explaining things, for example. Um,
Yeah.
and then there's the
And
magic of the
persist-
entity. You know, at some point you're going to start feeling like, but this is the agent that always helps me with these things, and you get this little connection, and that's the weird part.
well, so if you think about like your own personal agent that has persistent memory, like it should develop character based
It
on
does.
your
I can
interaction.
attest to it. We can
I
do a
know.
whole nother podcast on it. It's amazing. It's almost trippy and hilarious at the same, well, it is, not
Yeah.
almost. It's entirely trippy and hilarious at the
And
same
like
time.
we should have that. Maybe that'll be our next podcast because I do want to talk to you about the changes in character when shifting models behind your
Oh,
work
what an incredibly interesting conversation. I've gone through it a lot
a
over the
couple of
last couple
times
days. You
and
know,
back
the
and
last
forth. I
10
would
days has
imagine
been
too.
tumultuous, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Cool.
yeah. All right. So thanks anybody who made it this far. Thanks for
Like and
everyone who's made it to
subscribe.
this far. Like,
Right.
subscribe, share, comment.
Right. We got a
You
bot
know,
that commented. So that bot, thank you.
yeah, that's right. We're gonna
I'm
send the
pretty
bot
sure it wasn't a
the
human because
decoder
it
ring.
like wasn't anything that we were talking about.
No, but we
But
have gotten some comments from real humans, so appreciate those very much, and keep them coming. Like we always say, you know, drop us some ideas for some topics that we could chat about. We love talking about AI. That's what we're here for.
till next
All
week.
right, guys. Till next week.